wind came first, a low moaning sound that swept across the Carolina coastline like a warning. And then the rain, fast and merciless, striking the windshield of Khloe Morgan's aging Ford with 1,000 urgent hands. The two-lane stretch of Highway 70 outside Seabrook was already treacherous on a clear night, snaking past dunes and marshes with no more light than the occasional reflective sign. But in this storm, the world had narrowed to a dim tunnel of her wiper's frantic sweep and the wavering white lines beneath her tires. Her knuckles whitened against the steering wheel. 8 months pregnant and bone-tired from a double shift at Harper's Harbor Cafe, Khloe was running on stubbornness alone. The air inside the car was damp with the scent of rain-soaked wool from her sweater, and the heater groaned in protest with every mile. She'd told herself she could make it home before the worst of the weather hit, but the storm had arrived early, cutting across the coast like a sudden change of heart. The baby stirred beneath her ribs, a slow rolling movement, and she took a deep breath, grounding herself. Every dollar she'd scraped together over the last few months was for this child, for diapers formula, the crib she'd assembled alone in the corner of her tiny bedroom. She could live with her cottage's leaky roof and the old heater that coughed before it worked, but not with the thought of her baby wanting for anything. That meant pushing herself past exhaustion, accepting double shifts when they came, and sometimes driving home through nights like this one. She slowed for a curve headlights, bouncing off the slick blacktop, and that's when she saw it. A shadow, half-formed in the rain's blur. A figure moving along the narrow shoulder, bent slightly forward against the wind. Her heart gave a startled kick. Out here, there was nothing. No streetlights, no gas stations, just miles of ocean to one side and dark marshland to the other. She considered driving on, telling herself it wasn't safe to stop. Alone, heavily pregnant in the middle of a storm, she'd seen enough news stories to know how those decisions ended. But the next sweep of the wipers cleared her view, and her breath caught. The figure was a man tall, broad-shouldered, beneath a torn suit jacket, his white dress shirt clinging wetly to his frame. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, his face pale under the dim reflection of her headlights. One hand pressed against his side, the fabric there darker than rainwater. Blood. Her first instinct was to press harder on the gas, but she heard her mother's voice as clear as if she were sitting in the passenger seat. "We help when we can, Khloe. That's who we are. But we keep our eyes open." It was the creed Khloe had been raised on, an inheritance, as real as any fortune, though her mother had left little else behind when she died. She eased off the accelerator tires, hissing against the wet road. Her hand drifted to the glove compartment, where her pepper spray lay tucked inside, just in case. "Don't be reckless," she murmured to herself, though she wasn't sure whether she was warning herself away or giving herself permission to stop. The car's headlights found him again, as she drew closer. The man lifted his head, and their eyes met through the streaked glass. His were a sharp, improbable green, vivid even in the rain, and for a moment, she saw something there, not menace, but desperation, and a quiet sort of plea. She lowered the passenger window just enough for her voice to carry over the rain. "You all right?" she called, keeping her tone steady. His lips moved, and his voice, though low and edged with pain, carried a trace of refinement. "Please, I need a ride into town. I won't hurt you, I swear." Everything in her warned her to keep driving, but he was limping badly, each step a hitch in his stride. She thought of the night her mother had taken in a stranded neighbor during a hurricane, heavily pregnant herself with Khloe's older brother. "Kindness is our legacy," her mother had said, stirring soup on a candlelit stove, while the wind battered their old house. Khloe glanced at her belly where her baby's soft kicks seemed to press for an answer. She popped the locks with a click that sounded far too loud in the storm. "You can get in," she said, "but I'm warning you. I've got protection, and I know how to use it." A faint smile, almost rueful, flickered across his face. Fair enough. He pulled the door open and lowered himself into the seat, the scent of rain and salt, and something metallic blood following him in. He moved stiffly, wincing as he pulled the door shut. "Thank you," he said, his breath uneven. "I'm Charles Clark." She didn't offer her name in return right away, just shifted the car into drive and eased back onto the road. "You're hurt," she said. "The hospital's closer than town." "No hospitals," he said quickly, but not unkindly. "Just somewhere to rest. I'll be fine." The way he said it, as if refusing a hospital were the most natural thing in the world, made her glance sideways at him. His suit was expensive, or had been before tonight, and his watch, though scratched, looked like it cost more than her car. Whatever trouble he'd been in, it wasn't the sort that happened to ordinary men on coastal backroads. "You don't look fine, Charles," she said. "I've had worse," he murmured, leaning back against the seat. They drove in silence for a time, the wipers keeping rhythm with the rain. Khloe's cottage wasn't far now, a small weathered place with peeling blue paint, a sagging porch, and just enough room for her, her baby, and the few things she called her own. She didn't usually bring strangers home. In fact, she never had. But turning him loose in this storm felt wrong. The man was bleeding, and maybe, just maybe, she knew something about being caught out in the elements with nowhere safe to go. "My place is close," she said finally. "I've got a first aid kit. I can patch you up. After that, you're on your own." His eyes slid open just enough to meet hers, something unspoken passing between them. "Thank you, Khloe," he said, as if her name was something he'd known all along. The rest of the drive was a blur of rain and headlights on slick pavement. She couldn't shake the feeling that picking him up had shifted something in her life, nudged it onto a path she couldn't yet see the end of. She thought again of her mother's words. Kindness could be dangerous, but sometimes it was the only thing worth risking. The storm raged on, but inside the car, a fragile silence settled. Khloe tightened her grip on the wheel, the warmth of the heater beginning to cut through the damp. She didn't know who Charles Clark really was, or why the name carried a faint echo she couldn't place. But she knew this much: in a town like Seabrook, chance meetings had a way of becoming something more. And somewhere between the rain-slick highway and her own front door, she realized she'd stopped thinking about how tired she was, or how far the storm might spread. All she could think about was the stranger beside her, the sharp green of his eyes, the grit in his voice, and the way his presence felt like a question she wasn't sure she wanted answered. Outside, the ocean roared unseen beyond the dunes. Inside, the road ahead narrowed into shadow and rain. If you've ever believed that one unexpected moment can change everything, that kindness can alter the course of two lives forever, then stay with me. This is just the first night of Khloe and Charles's story, and it's one you won't want to miss. Like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and follow the channel so you're here for every twist, every confession, and every heartbeat that follows. The cottage crouched at the edge of the marsh like a secret peeling blue paint. A shallow porch that sagged with the weight of storms past a single porch light, smudged by salt and wind. Khloe cut the engine, and the sudden quiet was startling. Only rain and ocean, and the tick of cooling metal filling the night. "Stay with me," she said, stepping out into the sluicing dark. Mud took her sneakers with a soft, reluctant sound. The porch steps answered her weight with a weary groan. When she rounded to the passenger side, the man had already braced a hand on the door breath, coming in measured pulls, jaw tight against pain. Up close, the blood wasn't theoretical. It had threaded a dark ribbon through the torn hem of his shirt, soaked the waistband of his trousers, smeared along the heel of his palm, where he'd tried to press the wound still. His green eyes lifted to hers clearer than on the road, and anchored by something like discipline. "Charles," he said as if reintroducing himself, might lend steadiness to the world. "I can manage." "You don't have to," she answered. "Give me your arm." He hesitated, pride flaring and fading in a heartbeat. Rain slicked the curve of his cheekbone, traced the seam of a small cut near his eyebrow. He offered his forearm at last, and she hooked it firmly, bearing as much of his weight as her own center of gravity would allow. The baby shifted a patient tidal turn, and she adjusted her stance without thinking, finding the balance she had learned in kitchens and double shifts and other thresholds she'd crossed alone. They made an awkward procession up the steps, and for a breath in the shelter of the shallow roof, the storm softened. Khloe fumbled with the key ring, the brass cold against her fingers. The door opened on a rush of lavender and damp wood. The small living room stilled as though listening. A hand-me-down sofa, a second-hand bookshelf, a lamp with a floral shade, whose fringe had lost the battle with time. Nothing precious, but everything fought for. She guided him the final steps inside and eased him onto the plaid couch. The springs complained, then settled. Charles closed his eyes briefly, as if to master the interior world of pain before it mastered him. "I meant it," Khloe said, dropping her keys in the bowl by the door. "I have protection." He angled a glance at her, not quite a smile. "I believe you." The heater coughed awake with her nudge to the dial, stirring the faint warmth that clung to the room. She moved with the economy of a ritual performed often, a towel from the linen cabinet, the battered red first aid kit from beneath the sink, a dish of clean water. She looped the towel around his shoulders, first blotting rain from hair and collar, then set the kit on the coffee table and knelt. "Before we start," she said, snapping on a pair of thin gloves, "you should know I'm not a nurse. I've watched enough first aid videos to be dangerous, but I draw the line at stitches." "Understood." His voice was cultured even when tired. A vowel softened here, a consonant precise there. The sound of boardrooms and briefings woven through pain. "If it needs a hospital, you'll tell me." "If it needs a hospital, I'll drive you myself," she said. "You can argue from the passenger seat." That earned her a quiet sound, the suggestion of a laugh, brief and stranded. She peeled his shirt carefully away from the gash along his ribs, revealing skin mapped with bruises in shades of night sky, purple-green, the yellow fade toward day. The cut was deep but clean, as if from a sharp edge rather than a jag of glass. She soaked a pad of gauze and set to work, the sting of antiseptic rising between them. How she asked, keeping her voice even. Wrong place, wrong time. He watched her hands for a beat, rain still glistening at the curve of his eyelashes. "Something like that." Something she echoed that left you on a back road in a $1,000 suit. He exhaled a thread of air that wasn't quite a sigh. There was a meeting that became an argument that became detainment. "I got out, but not gracefully. I don't want to involve the police if I can help it. And a hospital would complicate the story." She pressed clean gauze to the wound and met his gaze until he gave her the rest. "I'm visible," he said finally, a spare confession that admitted more than it revealed. "There are people who would use that visibility either to help me or hurt me. I don't want either tonight." The way he chose his words, not evasive so much as careful, nudged memory at the edge of her thoughts. Clark. Such a common name, she told herself automatically. There were Clarks in every county from here to the mountains. Names echoed. That was what names did. Still, some old door creaked open in the back of her mind, and a draft of remembered air slipped through. She taped the bandage into place and sat back on her heels, removing the gloves. "You'll live." "Is that your official medical opinion?" "That's my mother's," she said before she could stop herself. She used to say a good night's sleep and a clean bandage could solve 90% of what the world throws at you. The other 10% needed prayer and stubbornness. Do you have both? Enough to get through tonight? She stood aware of the tug at her lower back and crossed to the small bedroom. In the closet on the top shelf, a box held what she had not yet gathered the courage to donate: a faded t-shirt, soft with age, and a pair of gray sweatpants. Neutral things that had once belonged to Malik and belonged to no one now. She swallowed, lifted them out, and returned to the living room. These should fit well enough, she said, eyes on the folded stack, rather than the man on her sofa. I'll turn around. She did, giving him the clean decency of privacy, though the rustle of fabric still sent a flush up her neck. She focused on the ordinary, the hum of the heater, the tick of rain against the window pane, the glow of the lamp catching a tiny fingerprint smear she'd meant to wipe earlier. When he murmured, "Done," she turned back. The transformation was small but startling. The tailored ruin of the suit had cleared away, and what remained was a lean frame that suggested athlete more than aristocrat, a posture that tried not to wince and almost succeeded. The bandage held. The cut at his temple had stopped bleeding. "Tea?" she asked. "Yes," he said, relief threaded through the single syllable, as if the word itself warmed him. In the kitchen's slender light, she set water to boil and reached for the jar of chamomile she saved for difficult nights. The cottage carried a catalog of such nights, wind and cracked pipes and bills, that didn't care whether a woman's feet ached or her belly pulled heavy after 14 hours on shift. She glanced at the refrigerator, where a single ultrasound photo was held up by a magnet shaped like a gull. The grainy profile, the curve of possibility. When she came back with 2 mugs, Charles was studying the spines of the few books on her shelf. Cookbooks. A slim collection of coastal poems, a thrift store copy of A Stargazer's Guide with a paper-thin cover gone to velvet at the edges. His gaze rested there. "You read the sky?" he asked, accepting his cup. "When it's clear," she said. "The marsh is good for it. Less light." She hesitated, then added, I used to. When I needed one honest thing that didn't want anything from me." There was a tiredness to him that didn't read as weakness, the kind of fatigue carved by responsibility and its shape in a man's life. She recognized the look. She had worn it. He nodded toward the ultrasound. "You have someone to look up for now." "We look forward," she said more sharply than she intended, then softer. "But yes." Silence folded between them, not empty, just sturdier than the fragile quiet of the car. He blew across the surface of his tea and winced when the motion pulled at his ribs. "Khloe," he said, testing her name in that exact voice, as if it were something fragile and worth the care. "You shouldn't be helping me. I know what it costs to get involved. And I know what it costs to drive by," she replied. She took the chair opposite the one she had pulled from a yard sale and painted the pale green of sea glass. "Tonight, I'm the one with the keys, and you're the one on my couch. We can live with the arrangement a few hours. I'll be gone at dawn." He glanced at the door, then back, a promise rather than a threat. "You and your child won't have to worry about me being a complication. Complications have a way of showing up whether they're invited or not." She sipped her tea. "But thank you for the courtesy." His gaze flicked to the old clock on the mantel, to the rain sliding silver against the window, to the pepper spray she'd left deliberately visible beside the bowl of keys. Respect moved over his face, like a small, unpracticed weather system. "I meant it on the road," he said after a while. "I won't hurt you." "I know. Do you?" He tilted his head, not insulted, simply curious. "You don't know me. I know the difference between danger and damage," she said. "You look like a man who's been damaged tonight. Danger doesn't say thank you this many times." His mouth did that almost smile again, a line easing at the corner. He drank, and the chamomile did what chamomile could. "Your last name," she said as casually as she could manage, as if she weren't listening for ghosts. "Clark." He tipped his head in acknowledgement. "Yes, it's common." "It is." She left it there, though the old door in her mind creaked wider. Names faces a memory of laughter with a different timbre, and the taste of county fair cotton candy, the bright spinning blur of a Ferris wheel, and a promise that hadn't learned yet what the world could do to promises. She pressed the heel of her hand lightly to the place under her ribs, where the baby answered with a flutter, and she let the door close mostly. "You should sleep," she said, setting her empty mug on the table. "There's a blanket in the chest and a pillow in the basket by the chair. I'll fetch them." She did, layering the couch with the clean thrift store quilt, smoothing the corner, as if neatness could persuade peace to settle. He watched her with a look that wasn't appraising and wasn't pitying. Gratitude simply worn with a hesitance that suggested he hadn't needed to wear it often. "Khloe," he said again. "I don't have language for this. That doesn't sound like a ledger." "Thank you." "Don't make it a debt," she answered. "Let it be a night." She clicked off the living room lamp, leaving the porch light and one small glow in the kitchen to keep the storm at the polite distance of glass. At the hall's mouth, she paused. "The bathroom's straight ahead," she said. "If the heater decides to sing, ignore it. It's old and proud of itself." He nodded. "Good night." Her bedroom door closed with its familiar soft latch. She turned the lock out of habit, not fear, and leaned her forehead against the cool wood. On the dresser, the ultrasound winked in the faint light, the arc of future wrapped in black and white. She sat on the edge of the bed and let her hands rest over the slow tide of her belly. Through the wall, the house spoke its old language of settling beams and storm-sieved breath. She heard the quiet shift of weight from the sofa, the long exhale of a man trying to lie down without pulling at stitches he didn't have. Somewhere in the marsh, a heron complained, indignant at weather. Khloe watched the room sharpen and soften with every lightning blink, and thought against her will of the name she had pretended not to hear correctly. Clark. A line of letters, a bridge between nights that had nothing to do with each other except that they did. They. Common, she said aloud. The word went nowhere and came back. Sleep, when it arrived, did so in shallow tideways. She dreamed of headlights and green eyes, and the first time in months, she didn't dream of bills. In the dark somewhere between thunder and dawn, she woke once unsure why, then understood the baby had turned a long, elegant movement that felt like a yes. She smiled, her palm spread to the shift. In the other room, Charles Clark breathed evenly for the first time since the road. On the coffee table beside the cooling mugs, the first aid kit sat closed, a small red square of order. And out beyond the cottage, the storm kept calling the marsh by all its old names, until the marsh, stubborn as any mother, gave up none of them. Morning found Seabrook still rinsed in the pale aftertaste of the storm. The marsh glittered in places where sunlight pooled over standing water, and gulls wheeled low over the shore, as though surveying the damage. Khloe woke to the smell of coffee, her own brand, though she knew she hadn't made it, and a silence from the living room that felt deliberate rather than empty. When she stepped into the hallway, the sight stopped her. Charles, fully dressed in the sweatpants and t-shirt she'd left for him, standing by the window with a mug in his hand. His hair was still damp from a shower, combed back, and the early light caught on the faint green in his eyes. The wound at his ribs had made him move carefully, but there was a steadiness to him this morning she hadn't seen last night. "I didn't mean to wake you," he said, turning toward her. "You didn't." She crossed to the counter where the coffee maker sat, her gaze flicking over the sink, clean the towels folded, then back to him. "How'd you sleep? Better than I deserved," he replied, a trace of dry humor under the words. It was easier to talk about small things, the way the storm had blown the porch mat halfway into the marsh grass, how the heater had run warm for once, without coughing in protest. They didn't speak about the injury, or what had put him on that road in the first place. Khloe let him leave that door closed. She had her own doors she preferred locked. When he left, it was without fanfare. No exchange of numbers, no promise to repay her, just a quiet thanks at the threshold, and a look that felt more like an acknowledgement than a goodbye. She watched him step into the light, his shoulders straight, his stride still measured, and then he was gone. The week that followed should have been ordinary work at Harper's Harbor Cafe prenatal appointments, the routine comfort of neighbors who measured the day by tides and weather reports. But by Thursday afternoon, the first ripple came. Khloe had just finished refilling the salt shakers when Renee Parker slid into the booth across from her, eyes bright with mischief. So Renee began. "Want to tell me why Seabrook's Grapevine has you as the star of its latest story?" Khloe frowned. "Which story is that?" "The one where a handsome stranger in a black sedan was seen outside your cottage the morning after the storm. Tall, dark hair, green eyes." Renee leaned in. "You want to save me some guesswork?" Khloe set the salt shaker down a little too firmly. "It's nothing. I helped someone. That's all." But Seabrook was small, and helping someone was the kind of phrase that grew legs and wandered into other people's kitchens. By the weekend, customers were speaking her name a little differently, with a half smile or a curious glance. And Renee was reporting that half the town thought Khloe had rescued a movie star, while the other half assumed it was a fugitive from the city. Khloe tried to keep her head down. She hadn't expected to see him again, which made it all the more jarring when she walked out of her front door one morning to find a brand new SUV parked where her rust-bitten Ford had been. The paint gleamed an ocean-deep blue. The leather seats still carried the faint, expensive scent of newness. On the driver's seat was an envelope with her name in neat, deliberate handwriting. Inside a note. "For the night, you didn't look away. No strings. And $10,000 in crisp bills." She stared at the money for a long moment before setting it down on the counter, the weight of the envelope absurd against the smallness of her kitchen. That afternoon, she found him. The call came through the cafe's landline, no name given, just a request to meet by the pier. She almost didn't go, but curiosity was a tug she couldn't ignore. The pier was half empty, a wind curling off the water and carrying the salt into her lungs. Charles stood at the far end, his hands in the pockets of a tailored coat, the cut of it clean against the gray sweep of the sea. "I told you, no strings," he said, when she stopped a few feet away. "You also didn't ask if I wanted them," she replied, her voice steady. "I don't take gifts like that. Not from strangers." "I'm not a stranger," he said, and something in the way he looked at her made her feel the words in her chest before she heard them. "Not anymore." She crossed her arms, the wind catching her hair. "I didn't help you so you'd replace my car or pay my bills. I helped you because you were bleeding in the rain. And I'm grateful," he said simply. "More than I can explain. That's not gratitude. That's something else. Penance guilt. Maybe it's what I can give in a world where most people only take." He countered, his gaze unflinching. "You didn't know who I was and you still stopped. That's rare." She hated that part of her, wanted to believe him. "Rare or not, I don't need saving." "You don't," he agreed. "But maybe I do." The words landed between them, heavier than the wind, heavier than the tide. She searched his face for the kind of insincerity she'd learned to expect from men who moved in his kind of world. But what she found was quieter, a sort of earnestness that made it harder to turn away. By the following week, the SUV was still in her driveway, the envelope still untouched in her dresser. The cafe, however, was far from untouched. On Tuesday morning, The bell over the door jingled, and two women Khloe didn't recognize slid into a booth, their phones already out. They ordered coffee and spent the next hour whispering to each other, their eyes darting toward her. By evening, Renee reported that someone had posted a blurry picture of Khloe stepping into the SUV, the caption reading, "Seabrook's own Cinderella." It would have been laughable if it hadn't been accompanied by the slow creep of reporters into town, one spotted at the gas station, another lingering outside the post office. They weren't here for the sea air. The final push came on a Friday afternoon, when Khloe was wiping down the counter, the sun slipping low enough to stripe the floorboards. She heard the low rumble of an engine, the kind that didn't belong to Seabrook's usual trucks or sedans. And when she looked up, Charles was standing in the doorway. He was dressed differently this time. No coat, just a sweater that looked warm enough to belong to another season entirely. The wind from the open door curled into the cafe, carrying with it a faint, clean cologne. "Can we talk?" he asked, and though his voice was low, it carried over the quiet hum of conversation. She led him to a corner booth away from the curious glances. "You've made things complicated," she said as soon as they sat. "I know," he said, not trying to soften it. "I should have thought about what showing up in your life would do. But I didn't. And now the wrong people are paying attention." "You mean the reporters, or the ones who put you on that road in the first place?" He didn't answer right away. Both. The space between them was filled with the scent of coffee and the distant cry of gulls. Khloe folded her hands on the table, her nails pressing faint half-moons into her palms. "I can deal with gossip," she said. "I can deal with small-town stares. But I can't deal with being a story someone else writes." "Then let me help you take the pen back," he said, leaning forward. "How by making sure the only story told is the truth that you helped a man who needed it. And that's all." "Is that all, Charles?" She asked the question sharper than she intended. Something flickered in his expression there and gone again. "It's the only part I'm ready to explain." She could have pressed. She didn't. Instead, she leaned back, the booth creaking softly beneath her. "You're not going to leave this alone, are you?" "No," he said. And it wasn't a challenge. It was a statement of fact, steady and sure. Outside the window, the tide had turned the water, drawing back from the pilings in a slow retreat. Khloe watched it for a moment, wondering whether retreat was strength or surrender. When she looked back at him, she realized she still didn't have an answer. The cafe had quieted to its late afternoon hush, that small lull between the lunch crowd and the early dinner regulars. Outside, the winter sun slipped low over Seabrook, brushing the marsh grass with copper light. Inside, the air carried the mingled scents of coffee grounds and the day's last batch of cornbread cooling on the counter. Renee Parker had been Khloe's anchor for as long as she could remember. They'd weathered heartbreak's gossip and the long, bone-tired nights when neither of them could see beyond the next paycheck. Now, Renee leaned her elbows on the stainless steel pass-through between the kitchen and dining room, watching Khloe with a look that was part curiosity, part concern. "You've been somewhere else all day," Renee said, her voice light, but threaded with something firmer. "And don't tell me it's because we're out of rye bread." Khloe paused in the act of restocking mugs, her fingers tightening around the porcelain. She had been somewhere else on the pier, in the SUV's leather seat, in the look Charles had given her, that made her both wary and aware. She exhaled slowly. "It's not the bread," she said. "I didn't think so." Renee came around the counter and nudged her toward the corner booth they kept for slow afternoons. The light there was warm, softened by the streaked glass of the front window, and the world outside seemed farther away. "Talk to me, Khloe." For a moment she wanted to shrug it off, make some joke about Charles Clark and the whirlwind of speculation he'd stirred up in their small town. But the weight in her chest had been pressing for too long, the truth knocking against its walls like a tide against a pier. Renee was the one person she could trust to see it all and not turn away. "There's something I haven't told anyone," she began, her voice low. Renee didn't flinch. She simply wrapped her hands around her mug, ready to hold whatever came next. 5 years ago, Khloe said I was engaged. His name was Daniel Clark. Renee's brows lifted slightly. Recognition flickering there, Clark, like Charles. He was. Khloe's gaze drifted to the cafe's front window, to the gray-blue horizon beyond the street. He was everything I thought I wanted. Charming, impulsive, the kind of man who could make a whole room turn toward him without trying. We met in Wilmington. He'd come into the diner where I was working back then. We fell fast. Renee stayed quiet, letting the current carry Khloe's words. But Daniel had edges. Khloe went on. He liked to drink, sometimes too much. I told myself it was just a phase, that he'd settle down once we got married. That night, she broke off, drawing a slow breath. That night we'd been out with friends. He'd had too many. We argued. I begged him to give me the keys. He wouldn't. Her throat tightened at the memory, and she forced herself to keep going. I thought, if I got in the car with him, I could talk him down, make him pull over. Instead, he pushed harder on the gas. We didn't make it a mile before he lost control, hit a tree. Her voice dropped. Daniel died on impact. I woke up in the hospital with a concussion and bruises, and the newspapers saying I'd been the one behind the wheel. Renee's eyes softened, but she didn't rush in with comfort. She knew better than to patch over something that deep with words too quick. His family blamed me, Khloe said. They shut me out of the funeral. The police report was clear. Daniel was driving blood alcohol twice the limit. But the Clark name had weight, and the papers leaned on that. People believed what they wanted. That I'd killed him. Renee shook her head slowly. And Charles? He doesn't know. Khloe admitted. The words tasted like confession and fear in equal measure. Back then I never met him. He was living in New York running his company. His parents made sure he stayed away. And I... She spread her hands helplessly. I thought if I left it buried, it couldn't hurt me again. Renee leaned forward, her voice gentle but sure. Khloe, you know that's not how it works. Secrets like that, they don't stay buried forever. And now you're in his life, whether you meant to be or not. Khloe closed her eyes briefly. If he finds out from someone else, it'll be worse. Renee finished for her. You need to tell him yourself. The thought twisted in Khloe's chest. She could still see the look on Charles's face when she'd refused his gifts, the way he'd listened without interrupting on the pier. She wanted to believe that same man would listen to this. But Daniel's ghost stood between them, heavy with everything she hadn't said. And what if it changes the way he looks at me? She asked quietly. What if he sees me the way his parents did? Like I'm the woman who ruined his brother. Renee didn't hesitate. Then he's not the man you think he is. But if he is, if he's what he seems, you'll know because you trusted him with the truth. Outside, a gull cried, the sound sharp against the low hum of the town. Khloe stared at her reflection in the window. Tired eyes, hair pulled back from her face, the faint swell of her belly pressing against her apron. She had built her life back from splintered pieces once before. She could do it again if she had to. Do you think he'll understand? I think Renee said he's already seen more of you than you realize. And if he's worth the trouble he's causing in this town, he'll want to see the rest, even the hard parts. Khloe let the words settle. She thought of the storm that had brought Charles to her door, the quiet between them in her living room, the way he'd looked out at the marsh like it was the first open space he'd had in years. There had been no pity in his gaze, only a kind of recognition. Maybe he would understand. Or maybe he would walk away. Either way, the past was no less hers. Renee reached across the table and covered her hand. "Whatever you decide, you won't go through it alone. Not this time." Khloe's throat tightened again, but she nodded. "Not this time." The cafe's bell chimed as a couple of tourists wandered in, shaking off the cold. Khloe rose automatically, slipping back into the rhythm of work. But her mind was elsewhere. The past was no longer content to stay in the dark. It had been stirred, brought to the surface by the same green-eyed man who'd bled on her couch by a chance meeting in the rain. As she poured coffee for the newcomers, she realized her hands had stopped trembling. Telling Renee had been the first step, and it hadn't broken her. The next would be harder. But she'd faced harder things. And somewhere beyond the hum of the espresso machine and the faint chatter of customers, Khloe thought she could almost hear the tide changing. The wind was sharper now, carrying the bite of winter in from the Atlantic. Seabrook's streets glimmered under the pale glow of street lamps. The air scented faintly with wood smoke and salt. Khloe locked the cafe's front door behind her, the last of the day's warmth still clinging to her skin, and pulled her scarf higher against the cold. She had barely taken 3 steps toward home when she saw him. Charles stood across the street beside a black sedan, the same one she'd seen on the pier days ago. He wasn't wearing the heavy coat this time, just a wool sweater under a charcoal jacket, his posture easy yet deliberate, as though he'd been there long enough to weather the chill without noticing it. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he crossed toward her, his stride purposeful but not hurried, the soft thud of his shoes barely audible above the hum of the wind. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said, his voice low enough that it felt meant only for her. "You didn't," she replied, though her pulse had quickened. "What brings you here tonight?" He hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. "I wanted to see you, and to ask something." The weight of his gaze was steady, and Khloe felt the familiar war between instinct and curiosity. "Ask what?" "There's a winter gala tomorrow night in Beaufort," he said. "It's a charity event for the Coastal Wildlife Foundation. I have a table reserved, and I'd like you to come with me." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through her chest. Beaufort. A gala. Her in that world. His world under crystal chandeliers and curious eyes. "I don't." She searched for a reason to refuse. "That's not really my scene." "I know," he said simply, "but I'd like it to be just for one night." It wasn't a plea, and it wasn't a command. It was an invitation, quiet but deliberate, and she recognized the way he was leaving the choice entirely in her hands. Why, she asked, her voice softer now. Something unreadable flickered in his expression. "Because I want the people I know to meet the woman who pulled me off that road." And because his pause stretched just long enough for the night air to fill it. "I think they should see what I see when I look at you." The sincerity in his tone tightened something low in her chest. She wanted to tell him no to stay safe in the familiar edges of her world. But she also wanted God help her to see what she might look like in his. "I don't have anything to wear to a gala," she said at last. "I'll take care of it," he replied without hesitation. "That's not—" "It's not payment," he cut in gently. "It's a gift. Let me do this, Khloe." She held his gaze, trying to read the layers behind the words. Finally, she exhaled. "One night." A faint smile touched his mouth. "One night." The next morning, a dress arrived at her cottage in a long, pale box. She found it on the porch before dawn, wrapped in tissue as soft as breath. When she lifted it free, the fabric spilled over her hands, like water midnight blue, with a subtle sheen that caught the light. The neckline was modest, but graceful, the skirt flowing without weight. There was no note, only a smaller box beneath it containing a pair of silver earrings shaped like teardrops. Renee whistled when Khloe showed her that afternoon at the cafe. If I didn't know better, I'd think this man was trying to rewrite your entire life. Just one night, Khloe reminded her. Renee's look was knowing. Sometimes one night is all it takes. The drive to Beaufort was lit by the pale blush of sunset, fading into deep indigo. Charles arrived precisely at 7, his car gleaming under the street lamp. When she stepped outside, the cold bit at her skin before he opened the door, offering his hand without a word. For a moment, he just looked at her. Not the kind of look that cataloged details for praise, but one that lingered as if memorizing something unrepeatable. "You're beautiful," he said finally, with the quiet conviction of a truth rather than flattery. She found her voice only after a moment. "You clean up pretty well yourself." He smiled, brief and genuine, before helping her into the car. The Beaufort Gala was held in an old waterfront mansion, its white columns wrapped in garlands, the windows glowing like 100 lanterns against the night. Inside, the air hummed with soft music and low conversation, the scent of polished wood and champagne. Eyes followed them as they entered, not rudely, but with the casual curiosity of people who notice when someone new steps into their orbit. Charles greeted a few guests with a nod, but his hand remained at the small of Khloe's back, guiding her without steering. "You don't have to talk to anyone. You don't want to," he murmured, just for her. "I'm fine," she said, though the glitter of chandeliers and the murmur of strangers pressed close around her. They stopped at their table set with white linen and silver cutlery, the centerpiece a spray of winter roses. Across the room, she caught sight of a man in his 60s watching them, his gaze lingering a beat too long before shifting away. "Who's that?" she asked quietly. Charles followed her gaze. "Richard Holloway, old business associate. Ignore him." But she noticed the faint tightening of his jaw, the way his hand on his wine glass stilled. Over the next hour, she found herself speaking more than she'd expected to a marine biologist about nesting grounds, to a retired teacher about her favorite coastal trails. Charles listened as much as he spoke, stepping in when conversation veered too sharply toward business, or when someone's curiosity about her became too pointed. It was during the dessert course that it happened. A woman with sleek blonde hair and a gown the color of champagne approached their table. Her smile was polite, but her eyes held a glint Khloe couldn't name. "Charles," the woman said warmly, "I didn't realize you were bringing company." "This is Khloe Morgan," he said without hesitation. "Khloe, this is Victoria Ames." Victoria's handshake was cool, her gaze flicking over Khloe in a way that felt like assessment. "Lovely to meet you. How do you two know each other?" Khloe opened her mouth, but Charles's voice was even certain. "She saved my life." It was the truth, and yet the way he said it made Khloe's breath catch. Victoria's brows lifted, but she only smiled again before excusing herself. When they were alone, Khloe leaned toward him. "You didn't have to say it like that." "I meant it like that," he said simply. Later, as they stepped out into the cool night air, the scent of the river carried on the wind. Khloe found herself glancing back at the mansion's lit windows. She'd felt eyes on her all evening, some warm, some wary. But through it all, Charles's presence had been constant, not a shield exactly, but an anchor. The drive back to Seabrook was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt unbroken rather than empty. When he pulled up outside her cottage, he didn't turn off the engine right away. "I'm glad you came," he said, his voice low. "So am I," she admitted, and the honesty surprised her. For a moment, they sat there, the night wrapped around them, the air thick with words. Neither of them spoke. Then she opened the door, the cold brushing her cheeks as she stepped out. As she turned toward the house, she heard his voice again, softer now. "One night," he said as if reminding himself. She didn't look back. But inside, her pulse told her that one night was already becoming something more. By the time Saturday morning stretched its pale light over Seabrook, the town had already begun to hum with its own peculiar energy, the sort that told Khloe someone somewhere had started talking. It began at Harper's Harbor Cafe, where Khloe slipped behind the counter just after sunrise. The regulars were in their usual seats, steaming mugs of coffee before them, newspapers folded into neat halves. Yet every so often, she caught a glance, quick sidelong, and a shift in the quiet chatter that seemed to coincide with her movements. Renee noticed, of course. She always did. Either everyone's suddenly fascinated by our coffee refills, she murmured as she passed Khloe a tray of toast, or news travels faster than the tide around here. Khloe set the tray down with a steadiness she didn't quite feel. What news? Renee arched an eyebrow. You know what news. You and Charles Clark walking into the Beaufort Gala together, like you've been stepping into rooms like that your whole life. Khloe opened her mouth to reply, but the bell above the cafe door chimed, and two women she recognized from the pier last summer came in, their laughter trailing behind them. They ordered cappuccinos, and before Khloe could turn away, one of them smiled. You looked beautiful last night, she said, with the lilting tone of someone who'd heard the story secondhand, but wanted to confirm it firsthand. Thank you, Khloe said simply, and moved to the espresso machine before more could be asked. The truth was, she'd barely had time to breathe since last night. The gala had felt like a dream. She'd drifted into Chandelier's crystal glasses, the faint scent of Charles's cologne, when he leaned to speak close to her ear. And yet somewhere between the polite introductions and the pointed stares, she had felt something else. The sharp edges of a world where people weighed you in seconds and kept their verdicts to themselves. This morning the edges were here too, disguised as curiosity. By mid-morning, Renee had cornered her near the stockroom. Okay, spill it. Did you have a good time? Or am I supposed to read about it in the Seabrook Chronicle's gossip column? Khloe gave a short laugh. It was more than I expected. In a good way. She hesitated. In a complicated way. Renee studied her for a moment. Complicated can be good. It can also be the first step toward trouble. Just be careful, Khloe. I know. And she did. She knew that stepping into Charles's orbit meant stepping closer to the light and the shadows that came with it. That afternoon, as the sun slanted low over the marsh, Khloe walked home along the narrow road that wound past the docks. The salt wind tugged at her hair, and the sound of gulls carried across the water. She was almost at her gate when she saw him. Charles leaned against the fence post, his coat collar turned up against the chill. He straightened when he saw her, and the faint smile that touched his mouth felt almost like an apology. I hope I'm not intruding, he said. You are, she replied, though her voice lacked heat. But I'm letting you. He followed her up the short path to the porch, the boards creaking beneath their feet. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, leaving it open behind her. I wanted to see you, he said, lingering near the doorway, as though unsure if he was welcome to cross it. You saw me last night. This is different. She turned to face him, leaning a shoulder against the wall. What do you want, Charles? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his gaze steady. I wanted to thank you, not just for last night, but for showing up in a world you didn't ask to be part of. It's not my world, she said. It could be. He replied, his tone quiet, but unshaken. Something in the way he said it made her chest tighten. You don't know me well enough to decide that. I know you stopped for a stranger in the rain when you didn't have to. I know you didn't take the first thing I offered, even when you needed it. And I know... He broke off, his jaw tightening slightly. I know that when people looked at you last night, you didn't look away. She crossed her arms. You think that makes me fit for your world? I think it makes you stronger than most people in it. For a moment, the only sound was the faint ticking of the clock above her kitchen door. Khloe held his gaze torn between wanting to push him away and wanting to lean into the warmth that seemed to follow him even here. I heard whispers last night, she said finally. Not just about me, about you. He nodded once as though expecting it. My world is full of whispers. They don't matter unless you let them. That's easy to say when you've spent your life above the tide line. And you've spent yours in it, he said, which means you know how to keep your footing when the water rises. His words were meant as a compliment, but they slid under her skin in a way that felt almost too close. They ended up in the kitchen, where the conversation softened around the edges. Charles leaned against the counter while she made tea, his long fingers wrapped around the mug when she handed it to him. You're quiet, she said. I'm thinking. About, he met her eyes, about how to keep you from walking away before I've had the chance to know you. She felt the words more than heard them, low and certain, like the pull of a current. You think I'm going to walk away? I think you've done it before. He said, his gaze never wavering. With other people. With other things that mattered. She opened her mouth to argue, but the truth in it stilled her. She had walked away before, when staying would have meant breaking under the weight of other people's choices. This is different, she said, though she wasn't sure if she meant it for him or for herself. By the time he left, the sky had deepened into a navy dusk, the first stars faint above the horizon. He paused at the gate, his breath visible in the cold air. Khloe, he said, his voice softer now. Last night wasn't a performance for anyone else. It was for me. I wanted to see if you'd let me into your world the way you let me into your home. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she watched him go, the sound of his footsteps fading into the quiet. Inside the house felt smaller without him in it. She stood for a long moment by the door, her hand resting on the frame, before finally turning away. The tide was shifting. She could feel it. And she knew that the next wave, whether it carried her forward or dragged her under, was already on its way. Sunday mornings in Seabrook carried their own kind of hush, as though the whole town took its first breath only after the church bells began to ring. Khloe liked those hours before the day truly began. The pale light over the marsh, the distant thrum of waves beyond the dunes, the feeling that she could exist without eyes on her. But that morning, she woke to the sound of someone at her front gate. The knock came a moment later, 3 firm raps, unhurried, as if the person knew she was home. When she opened the door, the cold air rushed in, along with the sight of Victoria Ames standing on her porch. The same champagne-colored elegance from the gala clung to her, though now softened by a cream wool coat and a cashmere scarf looped neatly at her throat. Ms. Morgan Victoria said, her smile poised, but her eyes sharp as glass. May I come in? Khloe's first instinct was to refuse, but something about the way Victoria stood, too assured to be turned away, made her step aside. The living room felt smaller with her in it. Victoria moved like someone accustomed to spaces bending to her presence, her gaze flicking over the modest furniture, the worn throw on the couch, the single-framed photograph on the mantel. I hope I'm not intruding, Victoria said, settling into the armchair without waiting to be invited. I simply thought we should get to know each other. Khloe took the chair opposite. All right. What would you like to know? Victoria's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. You were a surprise, Khloe. No one expected Charles to appear at a gala with someone who isn't well, someone from his world. Khloe kept her voice even. And what world is that? The one where names open doors and family history isn't something people whisper about. It wasn't an outright accusation, but it was close. Chloe's hands stilled in her lap. I don't know what you've heard, she said slowly, but I'm not interested in being part of anyone's gossip. Victoria leaned forward, her tone softening, as if to mask the edge beneath it. Charles is a remarkable man, loyal, generous, but he's also fiercely protective of his family. And if there are complications in your past, I'd hate for them to surface in a way that would hurt him. There it was, the warning wrapped in courtesy. Khloe felt the weight of it settle between them. I appreciate your concern, she said, but Charles is capable of deciding for himself who he lets into his life. For the first time, Victoria's expression faltered, a flicker of something sharper passing across her features before she rose. Of course, I'm sure he is. She adjusted her scarf, her composure sliding neatly back into place. It was lovely to meet you, Khloe. I imagine we'll see each other again soon. The door closed behind her with a quiet finality. Khloe stood there for a long moment, her pulse unsteady, the chill of the morning sinking into her skin. That evening, Charles called. His voice was warm, but there was a faint tension in it, as though he'd been carrying something all day. I heard you had a visitor, he said after a pause. So you know, Khloe replied. I do. A beat of silence. I didn't send her. I didn't think you did. I'm sorry, Khloe. Victoria means well in her own way, but she doesn't always recognize boundaries. Khloe let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She was curious. That's all. No, Charles said, his tone low and certain. That's not all. She was testing you, and I'm not going to pretend I'm okay with that. The next day, the town's quiet hum seemed louder. At the cafe, a pair of customers whispered near the counter, their glances darting toward her before skimming away. Renee intercepted Khloe in the kitchen. Is this about the gala? Renee asked. It's about people deciding they know who I am without asking me, Khloe said, her voice sharper than she intended. Then maybe it's time you told them, Renee suggested gently. Or at least told the one person who matters. Khloe didn't answer. The thought of telling Charles about Daniel about the accident still felt like standing on the edge of a drop she couldn't see the bottom of. That night, Charles showed up again unannounced. The air outside carried the clean, briny scent of the tide coming in. He stepped inside without speaking, and for a moment, they simply stood in the narrow space of her living room. I didn't come here to talk about Victoria, he said. Then why are you here? His gaze softened. Because every time I leave, I keep thinking about coming back. There was no grand gesture, no carefully chosen words, just the quiet truth of it. And somehow, that was more dangerous than anything Victoria could have said. They ended up on the couch, the silence between them threaded with something electric. Charles sat close enough that the heat from his arms seeped through her sweater. You don't have to be afraid of me, he said, his voice almost a murmur. I'm not afraid of you. Then what? She hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't give away everything. I'm afraid of what happens if I let this go too far. His eyes didn't leave hers. What if it's already too far? The air seemed to thicken between them, charged with the weight of things unspoken. Khloe looked away, first her pulse unsteady. Later, after he'd gone, she stood at the window, watching his taillights disappear into the dark. The house felt too quiet without him, the shadows stretching longer across the floor. She wrapped her arms around herself, as though she could keep the warmth from fading. Somewhere deep down, she knew the truth. Whatever this was between them, it had already crossed the line she'd tried to keep. And no matter how carefully she stepped now, the tide was coming in. It was only a matter of time before it reached the door. The next few days passed in a strange rhythm, Charles appearing when she least expected, then vanishing just as suddenly, as if their connection existed in brief, bright flashes rather than a steady flame. Khloe told herself she needed that space. She told herself it gave her time to think. But the truth was, every time she heard the low growl of an engine outside, or caught sight of a tall figure on the street, her pulse betrayed her. On Thursday afternoon, the tide was out, leaving the marsh a patchwork of exposed mudflats and glistening pools. Khloe had left the cafe early, hoping for a quiet walk along the shoreline. The wind lifted the hem of her coat, carrying with it the salt-sweet scent of the sea. She was halfway to the jetty when she saw the man leaning against the weathered railing, a man she hadn't seen in nearly 3 years. Daniel. The sound of his name in her mind was enough to hollow her chest. He looked older now, leaner. The boyish ease he once carried, replaced with something harder around the edges. His hands were shoved deep in the pockets of his jacket, but when he saw her, his mouth curved into the same half-smile that had once been her undoing. "Khloe Morgan," he said, pushing away from the rail. "Didn't expect to find you here." She stopped a good 6 feet away. "Then why are you here?" His gaze flicked over her, lingering in ways that made her want to step back. "Passing through. Heard you were still in Seabrook. Figured I'd see if the rumors were true." "And what rumors are those?" she asked, her voice steady even as her pulse stumbled. "That you've found yourself a new benefactor." He said it with a careless shrug, but his eyes searched her face for a reaction. "Big shot billionaire. What's his name?" "Clark." Khloe kept her chin up. "You should leave Daniel." He took a step closer, his voice lowering. "You think he's gonna save you? Wipe it all clean? Doesn't work like that, Khloe. You know it doesn't." The wind off the water sliced between them, sharp and cold. For a moment, she could see the flash of that night 3 years ago. The screech of tires, the metallic tang of blood in the air, the weight of knowing that the damage was already done. "I'm not the same person you knew," she said quietly. Daniel's smile thinned. "Maybe not, but your past still belongs to you." She turned before he could see the flicker of fear in her eyes, and walked back toward town, the sound of her boots on the wooden planks loud in her ears. By the time she reached her cottage, the sky had begun to bruise into evening. She hadn't expected to see Charles there, leaning against her porch rail like he belonged, but the sight of him was almost enough to unravel the tight coil in her chest. "Almost. You look like you've been walking against the wind," he said, studying her face. "I have." He opened the door for her without question, letting the warmth of the house wrap around them. She busied herself with hanging her coat, hoping the motion would buy her enough time to mask the turmoil still buzzing under her skin. "What happened?" he asked, finally, his voice quiet but certain. "Nothing," she said too quickly. His brow lifted just slightly. "Khloe, I don't want to talk about it." She didn't mean for it to sound sharp, but the edge was there, and she saw him catch it. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the faint heat of his body in the narrow space between them. "Whoever it was," he said, "I hope they know you're not alone." She met his gaze, and something in her chest shifted somewhere between relief and terror. "Why do you keep showing up, Charles?" "Because I want to," he said simply. "Because you make me forget everything else I'm supposed to be doing." They ended up in the kitchen again, though neither of them touched the mugs of tea she'd made. The light over the table was soft, casting shadows that curled along the edges of his face. "Have you ever wished you could just erase a piece of your life?" she asked suddenly. He studied her for a long moment. "Yes." "Did you?" "No," he said. "You can't. You just decide whether it's going to define you or teach you." She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to. But the memory of Daniel's voice on the jetty clung to her cold as the wind that had carried it. Later that night, she stood at the window after he'd gone. the sound of the waves muffled by distance. Somewhere in the dark, Daniel was still out there. And if he'd found her once, he could find her again. But as she pressed her palm against the cool glass, another thought slipped in, one she couldn't push away. Charles had said she wasn't alone, and for the first time in years, she almost believed it. The text arrived before dawn, a faint buzz on the nightstand that threaded into Khloe's dreams and tugged her awake. The screen glowed with an unknown number and a photograph she knew too well. She and Charles on her porch, laughing over a paper bag of pastries. Her head tipped back, his mouth curved in that rare, unguarded way. Beneath it, a second image, a scan of an old hospital report, with her name and the words, concussion, contusions, the date stamped from 5 years ago. Tell him before I do. Her stomach went cold. The letters swam for a heartbeat, then sharpened into a threat she could feel at the base of her throat. She rose, wrapped her sweater tight, and stood at the window. Outside, the marsh was a charcoal wash of low tide and winter grass. Somewhere a gull screamed indignant at a world that had not asked its permission. Renee answered on the second ring. "You're up early." "I didn't sleep," Khloe said. "He sent me the hospital record." Malik Renee's voice lost its softness. "I'll be there in 10. "No, don't. Please. Not yet." Khloe watched the sky try on a first light that didn't stick. "He's watching. I can feel it." "Then you can't stay there." Renee paused, thinking in the way that had saved them both more than once. "Call him. Who? You know who." Khloe's finger hovered over Charles's name before she let it rest. He picked up on the first ring. "Khloe. I need..." She didn't know how to make the words into something that wouldn't change everything. "Can you come? I'm already on my way." He meant it. 10 minutes later, his headlights swept across the porch. He listened without interrupting as she showed him the messages, the photograph, the scan. When he finally spoke, his voice had thinned to a blade. "Whoever sent these wanted to frighten you," he said. "They won't get to keep that. It's Malik." She forced herself to say the name like a thing she could set down. "I think he's been following me." He nodded once, as if filing a piece into a shape that made sense. "There's something I have to tell you, too." He glanced at the window, the pale, not yet morning beyond it. "The man you saw on the jetty. It wasn't Daniel." Her breath caught. "What?" "I had my team pull the doc's camera feed," he said gently. "The footage isn't perfect, but it's enough height gate a scar on the jawline." He met her eyes. It was Malik. Her knees loosened with a relief that wasn't relief so much as grief, settling into the precise shape it had always held. "Daniel is gone," he said softly. 5 years now. I'll never let anyone use his ghost to hurt you." Something unclenched in her chest. The fear of being seen through the wrong lens eased, replaced by the ache of being seen at all. "Come with me," he said after a moment. "Just for a little while. I have a place in the mountains, Lake Clearwater. No one knows you there. You can breathe." She opened her mouth to refuse on principle, even as every instinct she had kept, circling the same words, "Not safe, not safe, not safe." She thought of the ultrasound on the refrigerator, the press of a small heel beneath her palm, the way winter light found the cracks in her cottage and made them ache. She nodded. "For the baby," she said. "For you," he said, and be the knot that held both truths. They left the coast, with the day still soft around the edges, the highway slipping beneath their tires in long gray ribbons. The air changed as they climbed the brine, thinning to pine, the sky cold and high and clean. By afternoon, the lake lay before them, iron dark, under a sky the color of tin, the cabin shoulder strong at the water's edge. Cedar logs, a stone chimney smoke like a thin thread rising steady from it. Mrs. Evelyn Harris opened the door before they reached it, her gray bun pinned neat, her eyes kind and assessing in one sweep. "You must be Khloe," she said, taking Khloe's hands in warm, competent fingers. "Come in before the wind steals you." The cabin breathed cedar and fire. A crib stood under the window, quilted stars turning lazy circles above it. Khloe's throat tightened at the sight. He called ahead. Mrs. Harris said quietly, following her gaze. "Said to have what you'd need." He didn't say why, but I've learned not to ask a good man why he's trying to do right. They settled into a rhythm that made sense. Tea steaming in blue mugs, the scratch and sigh of logs giving themselves to flame Mrs. Harris, moving through the kitchen with the practiced grace of someone who had lived long enough to know where everything goes and why. Charles stepped back into the cold to take a call, his voice a low murmur on the porch. He returned with a different quiet in his shoulders. "It won't touch you up here," he said when she looked up. "Sheriff Tate knows. Renee's with him. They're watching the cafe, the cottage. Malik's been sloppy. He won't get far." "How do you know?" "Because I ask the kind of people who make it their business to know." Something steeled and softened in the same moment. "You're safe here, Khloe." She believed him not just because of the words, but because of the way he kept the spaces around them. Warm lamps lit before the light failed. Extra blankets folded at the foot of the couch. The fire nudged without show. Safety didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply kept showing up. That night the wind rose and never quite lay down again. It worried the eaves and pressed a palm to the windows. Khloe slept lightly, waking to the sound of branches talking to each other and the baby turning within her like a tide. Near midnight, a stitch of pain threaded through her lower belly and pulled tight. It eased, then returned with purpose. She sat up, listening to her own breath. Mrs. Harris's knock came soft as a question. "You awake, dear?" "I think," Khloe swallowed. "I think it's time. Too soon." Mrs. Harris was already moving lanterns lifted from a closet. Like old friends, the generator switch tried and tried again without success. "Storm's worrying the lines," she murmured. "We'll make do until help gets here." "What help?" Panic rose like heat. Khloe pushed it back down. "There's no service. There's a radio in the shed. I'll get it." Mrs. Harris set a cool hand to Khloe's forehead and frowned. "You're warm. We'll keep you comfortable." She turned. Charles. He was there in seconds. Sleep shoved off his face the cut at his hairline from weeks ago. A faint white line now. He saw the pain slide through her and went still with purpose. "Tell me what you need," he said. "Stay," she whispered, "because bravery is smaller and truer when it's specific." He knelt, took her hand, and began to talk. Not the empty reassurances of someone who wanted the moment to be smaller than it was, but the steady, ordinary things that tethered her. The smell of the lake at dawn. The names of constellations. He remembered from a childhood book. The way the marsh near Seabrook gleamed when the sun found the right angle and turned water into coins. Between contractions, there were islands of breath and certainty. During them, there was only the body's work and the old memory of other women somewhere doing this, in other rooms, in other storms, the way the world keeps beginning. When the pain loosened enough to let words through, Khloe found the thing she had carried like a stone and brought it into the room. "Daniel," she said, eyes wet, breath ragged. "I was there. I tried to stop him. I was so sure I could talk him down, and I couldn't. The next wave rose. She rode it. When it broke, she gasped, 'I'm sorry. For him. For you.'" He didn't say hush. He didn't say it's nothing. He let the weight be what it was, and then shifted, so she didn't have to hold it alone. "I know," he said, and the words were a place to sit. Harold Sterling told me everything. A lawyer's name, a truth given borders. You fought for him. My family failed both of you. I won't do that again. Something fierce and gentle in the way he said again made her close her eyes and gather strength from it. Lantern light threw long, brave shadows across the ceiling. Mrs. Harris came and went, a metronome of calm, pressing a cool cloth to Khloe's temple, counting softly under her breath, listening with the practiced tilt of her head to the rhythm under Khloe's ribs. When the contraction's peak sharpened into a cliff, Khloe felt the unspooling of certainty. I can't. You can, Charles said, and all at once, the words weren't words, but a memory of every time she had survived what she was sure she wouldn't. You already are. Headlights swung through the trees, then wildly, and held two beams smudged by rain sliding over the cabin's rough logs. Boots thudded on the porch. The door opened on Sheriff Tate, rain-slick, and wind pushed Renee at his shoulder, with her hair braided tight, and Dr. Maya Patel shrugging off a wet jacket, her medical bag cutting a clean silhouette against the storm. We made it, Dr. Patel said, kneeling beside the sofa, as if she had practiced arriving precisely at the center of need. Let's meet this baby. How Khloe started tears, surprising her. Renee got through on a landline at the bait shop. The sheriff said, words clipped by the storm's impatience. And we picked up Malik an hour ago at the edge of Route 12, warrants for blackmail and fraud. He's done. The news landed like a door closing on a room Khloe never had to enter again. Relief lifted enough of the air that the next contraction could pass through it. Khloe, Dr. Patel said gently, eyes level voice, the kind that made people remember how to breathe. You're strong and a little warm, so we'll keep an eye on that. But your daughter's a stubborn one in the best way. When I say push, we push together. The storm battered the windows as if to be part of it. Inside the cabin, the world narrowed to the moan of wind in the chimney, and the counting and the squeezing of her hand, and the wild animal sound she didn't know she could make, and didn't care who heard. One more, Dr. Patel said, calm becoming command. Right there. That's it. The room broke open into a cry, thin, fierce, astonished at its own power. The doctor laughed aloud, the sound like light switching on. She's here. Mrs. Harris wrapped the small, damp miracle and set her in Khloe's arms, and time folded into something new. The baby blinked up dark eyes, storm-clear tiny fingers unfurling like promises that had never learned how to break. Grace. Khloe whispered the name, finding them, rather than the other way round. Grace Morgan. Hello, Grace, Charles said, and his voice broke on the hello. He touched the baby's knuckles with a finger, as if greeting a queen, then lifted his gaze to Khloe's, something helpless and reverent in it. You are, the word failed. He found another. Everything. Dr. Patel checked numbers and nodded to herself. The sheriff stepped back into the rain to take a call. Renee cried without apology and wiped her face with the heel of her hand. Mrs. Harris stood by the hearth and let herself smile, the kind of smile women keep in their pocket for births and weddings and moments when faith has the nerve to be right. When the room had quieted to the small sounds of a new life, learning the room that would hold it, Charles reached into his coat and came up empty. He laughed, once shaky. I don't have a ring, he said, as if confessing a breach of etiquette at the edge of the world. I have nothing but what I can say and do. He went to one knee anyway, not because tradition asked it, but because humility did. The lantern light caught in the green of his eyes and made them deeper. Khloe Morgan, he said, simple as breath, certain as tide. I love you. Be my family, yours, mine, hers. Let me be the place you don't have to be brave all the time." The answer was already waiting in her mouth, but she looked down first at Grace, at the small fist against her chest, at the thin blue vein that pulsed at her temple, like a metronome for the future. Then she looked back at him. "Yes," she said the word steady, the kind that stands up in a storm. "But it's all of us always." "Always," he echoed and rose to kiss her forehead, without jarring the sleeping weight in her arms. Outside, the wind began to tire of itself. The lake lay down by inches. The cabin held 3 heartbeats, where there had been 2, and the world, which had seemed too loud and then too small, found the exact size of the room that could hold a beginning. Morning arrived like a soft exhale. The storm spent the lake still as glass beneath a sky rinsed clean. The air smelled of cedar smoke and damp pine, of something new and unspoiled. Inside the cabin, the fire had settled into a low, steady burn, the kind that warmed without demanding attention. Khloe stirred before the baby, her body aching in places she hadn't known could ache, but her heart full in ways she'd stopped imagining for herself. Grace slept curled in the crook of her arm, her tiny breaths warm against Khloe's skin. Every so often, a small hand twitched in a dream, as if reaching for something only she could see. Charles sat across from them in the armchair, one ankle resting on his knee, watching with the kind of focus usually reserved for rare art or high-stakes negotiations. He had changed into a soft gray sweater, his hair still mussed from sleep, his expression unguarded. "You've been sitting there long?" she asked, her voice a murmur, so as not to wake Grace. "Long enough," he said, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "I didn't want to miss anything." "Not much to miss," she teased gently. "On the contrary," he said, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "This is everything worth seeing." Her cheeks warmed, not from shyness, but from the strange, fierce way his words rooted into her. Mrs. Harris bustled in from the kitchen with a tray tea, steaming in mismatched mugs, a plate of scones, and a bowl of fresh berries. Breakfast for the new family, she declared, setting it down on the low table. Khloe smiled. "Thank you, Mrs. Harris." "Nonsense," the older woman said with a wave of her hand. "You've done the hard work. The least I can do is feed you." She glanced at Charles with a knowing tilt of her head. "And you keep that tea warm for her. It's your first job as a father." Charles grinned, but his eyes softened at the word father, as if it had settled somewhere inside him and decided to stay. The day unfolded slowly, each moment deliberate. Charles took Grace so Khloe could shower holding the baby as if she were made of spun sugar. He spoke to her in low tones, telling her about the lake, the town, the marsh, and a cherry tree that bloomed behind his family's estate each spring. When Khloe returned, hair damp and cheeks flushed, she found them by the window. Grace's tiny fingers wrapped around one of Charles's, his head bent close to hers. The sight was so tender, it made something deep in her chest loosen. "You're good with her," she said softly. He looked up. "I want to be better than good." By afternoon, the lake drew them outside. The 3 of them walked along the shore, the sun pale but warm enough to cut through the chill. Khloe's boots sank into the damp earth, the sound of the water lapping against the rocks, steady and sure. "It feels different now," she murmured, watching the horizon. "What does?" Everything she said. Like the air has shifted, like I can breathe without counting the seconds until something goes wrong. Charles was quiet for a moment, then reached for her hand. "Maybe that's because we're done running from the past. It's still there, but it's not steering anymore." She glanced at him, at the man who had shown up for her, in ways she hadn't dared to hope anyone could. "You really think it's that simple?" "I think simple and easy aren't the same thing," he said. "But I do think it's possible." Back at the cabin, as Grace slept in her crib by the fire, Charles drew Khloe onto the couch. They sat in silence for a while, her head resting against his shoulder, his hand tracing idle patterns along her arm. "There's something I want to do when we get back to Seabrook," he said quietly. "What's that?" "Build something with you. Not just a house, though. If you want one, we'll find it, but a life. A business if you want it. A garden if you'd rather. Something that's ours from the ground up." She turned her head to look at him. "You're talking about more than a life together. I'm talking about a future we choose every day," he said. "One that Grace grows up in knowing she's safe, loved, and seen." Her throat tightened. "You make it sound easy." "It won't be," he said, "but it'll be worth it." As the afternoon faded into gold and shadow, Khloe stepped outside alone for a moment. The lake stretched before her, the water meeting the sky in a seamless line, as though the world had no end. She thought of all the places she'd been, all the versions of herself she'd carried through, and how somehow impossibly she'd ended up here on the edge of something new, with a man who had chosen her again and again. She heard the door open behind her, the crunch of his boots on the frost-tipped grass. Charles slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her back against him. "Whatever comes next," he murmured, "we face it together." She leaned into him, feeling the truth of it settle in her bones. "Together," she echoed. Inside, Grace stirred and let out a soft cry, the small, urgent sound of a life just beginning. Khloe turned toward the cabin, but Charles caught her hand. "Let me," he said, brushing a kiss over her knuckles. "You've done enough for one lifetime." She watched him go, the tall, broad-shouldered figure disappearing into the warm light. And in that moment, she knew home wasn't the cottage by the marsh, or even the cabin by the lake. Home was here wherever the three of them chose to stand. If you've been swept up in Khloe and Charles's journey through storms, secrets, and the quiet moments that make a life, let us know. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us which moment stayed with you, and follow for more stories where love finds its way, even against the odds. Because sometimes the most powerful tales are the ones that remind us we can begin again.